On what would have been Malcolm X's 83rd birthday, I wish to say good morning, and I want to thank the Guild for inviting me to speak today. I also want to thank you for promoting my book and selling my book. This is my first book, and I've been very nervous about it, but I'm hoping that you'll have an opportunity to read it and that you'll enjoy it or find something of interest in it. I need to begin by saying that what I'm about to say does not necessarily reflect the views of my employer, the American Federation of Government Employees. And I want to just be very clear about that. And if everyone can just join me by saying, "We understand, Bill." Right? Okay? Okay, good. All right. Very good. So, this topic, forging black-brown unity for a stronger labor movement. This could be a book, and in fact it should be. But I think, as my South African friends would say, we have to unpack the phrasing because of several things. One is that we have to clarify the distinction between the issue of black-brown unity from African-American immigrant relations. And we also have to identify that Latinos are not an ethnic group. That is not one ethnic group. That there are several different ethnic groups there. So talking about African-American Latino relations is itself very complicated because we're really talking about relations with various ethnic groups that are Latino. Let me give you an example. African-Americans have a very long history with Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans, and a very complicated relationship with Cubans. Right? If this discussion that we're having today had been in 1968 or even 1988, it would look and feel very different. The whole discussion of black-brown unity in 1968 or 1988 would be in a very, very different context. The civil rights and black power movements, for example, played a very important role with regard to the Puerto Rican movement and the Chicano movement. And the Puerto Rican independence movement and the Chicano movement also played a very important role vis-a-vis the African American movements. So black-brown issues and unity and relationships, this is not a new subject, even though we're in a very new and different context. On East Coast, for example, there are many overlapping neighborhoods between African Americans and Puerto Ricans. And it doesn't mean that the relationship has always been rosy, but it does mean that there has been a very long-standing relationship. There are different dynamics that exist between African Americans and Cubans, largely because of who migrated to the United States from Cuba. As a relative of mine, a deceased relative of mine, said when he watched the airplanes land in 1960, he looked at the complexion of the people that were getting off the planes and said, Now, the dynamics between African Americans and Latinos changed, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, with the increase of immigration from Latin America. In order to contextualize all of this, we have to actually go back and look at a little bit of history. And we have to recognize certain things about the United States. As my friend and mentor Manning Marable says, when you're looking at US capitalism, we have to always remember that it's racial capitalism. That is a very racialized system. To that I would add that it's a settler state. And that as with other settler states, there are certain dynamics, and I wish that we had more time that we could go through that, but there are certain very definite characteristics that virtually every settler state on this planet has. And one of the things has to do with the entire racialization of the population and the way that immigration itself is treated. So immigration in the United States began right after the American Revolution in a way that identified who could actually be a citizen and who could legitimately migrate to the United States. That began with the idea of white. But even there it becomes complex Because at the beginning of the founding of the United States, who was white is very different than who is considered white today. At the point that the US was founded, white was Britain, France, and Germans, for the most part. Not the Irish, and certainly no one that was Southern European. So over time, immigration policies changed in part to reflect a changing of the notion of white and the establishment of what I would call a white bloc. Now let me just jump back in the interest of time to talk some more about or situate this in the context of the black-brown divide. Although white supremacy has been and remains central to both the non-Latino peoples of color, peoples of African descent, and Latinos, it has played itself out in very different ways. Mexicanos and Chicanos were captured with their land. Africans, on the other hand, were stolen from our land. The white supremacy in the United States was formulated first and foremost, though, on two particular groups, Africans and Native Americans. This becomes very important as we go through time in understanding this is not about a hierarchy of oppression. This is about something else that's very, very critical, that every group that's either immigrated to the United States or been absorbed into the United States has to make a decision very early on, which is what is its relationship to African Americans and Native Americans on the one hand, and who is considered white on the other. And this usually takes a generation to sort itself out, and sometimes takes very bizarre forms. For example, in the early part of the 20th century, an entire debate about whether Armenians were white or not, and whether the Finns were white or not. And I'm not exaggerating, an entire debate about how these groups should be classified. And so within a generation, this all ends up getting worked out. But the African American and Native American experience essentially forms almost like a base in the United States, and groups have to define themselves vis-a-vis that, because race and the color line are about issues of not only oppression, but issues of social control, developed by the business elites in the 1600s. And the formation of the color line and the establishment of race as a socio-political category is used as a way of dividing up the population in order to serve the interests of the top. Puerto Rico, as opposed to the Chicano and African American experience, was captured and its people were subjected to colonial control, and in the case of thousands, eventually forced to migrate largely to the east coast of the United States. Once on the mainland, their experiences were remarkably similar, though not identical, to the African American experience. That's very interesting in contrast with those of the Mexicano and Chicano population, which in 1848 were declared by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to be white. Their land was stolen, and they experienced de facto Jim Crow oppression, yet legally speaking, they were declared to be white. Now this was it's interesting because even though this was a technically legal declaration, their experiences were nevertheless fundamentally different from Southern Europeans, and particularly Italians, that Chicanos are often compared with. In other words, the story sort of goes like, if the Italians can make it, why can't the Chicanos? But for the absorbed population, absorbed only in a technical sense of the aggression of 1848, the experience of the Chicano population was not in any way similar to that of the Italians. But this classification did end up creating an ideological block between the Chicano people and Chicano movement and the African American, which only in the 1960s really starts to erode. That is, that this notion of having been declared white, even though Chicanos knew that they were not white, nevertheless, they were not black. And that had an impact on the relationship of our movements, although we worked through a lot of that in the 60s and 70s. Dominicans had yet another experience having come from a country which was a neo-colony of the United States, invaded on more than one occasion, resulting in the migration of thousands to the United States. They, in fact, were the prototype, in many respects, for the migrants from South and Central America that started coming in largely in the 1980s and 90s. So what is this all to say? It's to say that the respective experiences share certain features in common in view of the fact of the interaction with and oppression by white supremacy. But each of these experiences has their distinctive traits. These distinctions, both among Latinos as well as vis-a-vis African Americans, are often misunderstood and regularly underanalyzed, as are our points in common. In this sense, the reference to people of color, while correctly emphasizing strategic unity, often covers over a complex relationship that is filled with contradictions. So then why then talk about the black-brown divide? There are several reasons. One is the changing demographics in the United States as a result of immigration and the end of the era that was captured by the notion of black and other minorities, which up until the early 1990s was a common reference that was used. Black and other minorities. African Americans are no longer the largest minority. A second factor, neoliberal globalization and the reorganization of global capital have had an impact particularly on African Americans and Chicanos, and particularly within the working class of those groups. Also related to that, the decline of unionized large-scale manufacturing has led to an erosion in the economies of those respective communities and a competition for declining resources. Third factor, the decline of the Black freedom movement as a result of both the economic and political ass-kicking that we've gotten, particularly since the mid-1970s, including with that repression, has had an impact on the relationship between African Americans and Latinos. And a fourth and somewhat controversial point is that there is an active attempt by some segments of the political right to whiten segments of the Latino population and of the Asian American populations, a fact that needs to be discussed at the level of strategy. So it's important for us to get, when we're talking about black-brown unity, that we can never replicate what might have existed in the late 60s and early 70s. That was a very, very important moment, but the moment has changed. Among other things, racial dynamics in the United States are not, they weren't then, but they certainly are not based on a notion of the black-white or black Native American versus white dynamic. We're dealing in a situation where it is appropriate to use the metaphor of a rainbow. That is, thinking about the relationship, a political relationship, and a progressive political relationship between various peoples of color, whites, versus the system that we're up against. The current tensions that exist between African Americans and Latinos most especially relate to competition for declining resources and the perception of who is to blame for the erosion of particularly the erosion of Black America. The altering of the workforce in certain key sectors, for example, janitorial, meatpacking, poultry, and in some respects construction, has been perceived as a racial or ethnic cleansing by much of Black America. In the absence of a class and power analysis of US capitalism, there's a tendency towards a racialization of this entire process and a blaming of the problem on immigrants rather than on capital. And this is something that you see particularly in Black America, even in sectors where there's absolutely no threat to competition from immigrants. It becomes a way of people acting out their anxieties about the declining situation in our communities. Black-brown unity can, if consummated, play a role in the future of organized labor. United, we can fight for a different sort of unionism that actually challenges white supremacy in the name of fairness and democracy. And we can unite in favor of cultural change within our movement. And there are certain important examples of where this has happened. In North Carolina, for example, Flock and the Black Workers for Justice put together an alliance some years ago to work together around very specific issues, but also to build a greater level of understanding between the Latino immigrant community and the African American community. And this has been very important. Also in North Carolina, the UFCW's Smithfield campaign has been very much trying to pay attention to the issue and relationship between Latinos and African Americans. And what I would say that these two have in common is the nature of the political leadership. That is, that this is not simply an opportunistic maneuver of trying to build allies, but the leadership in both cases recognizes that black-brown unity is of strategic importance and is actively working to try to make that happen. So black-brown unity, I would also add, is something that must go beyond the question of so-called diversity. We need to be building the sort of unity that is actually challenging the way that decisions are made within organized labor and not just who sits at the table. The movement in many ways is much more diverse than it once was, but it's not particularly inclusive. And by inclusive, I mean who actually makes the decisions and where. And that's why we really need to be talking about black-brown unity and this question of power, both within the movement, but as well as in the larger society. In the interest of time, what can we do about this overall situation? My recommendations are these, that we should be thinking, when I say we, I'm talking about very progressive activists in the labor movement. We need to be thinking about joint rank-and-file oriented educational programs, including things like town halls. One of the things that I suggested a couple of years ago is that this organization, the National Association of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, that they and, for example, the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists should do roadshows in various communities together, not separately, but jointly have roadshows that actually bring together our communities where there is discussion. Because among other things, there's not much discussion about the relative or respective histories of our various communities. For example, many African Americans have no clear sense of even the racial dynamics within the Latino population, nor necessarily who the different groups are. Many Latino immigrants have no sense of the African American experience, and much like many other immigrants, come to the United States and try to figure out why African Americans haven't done better. We need to be involved in joint struggles around U.S. foreign policy. One of the things that I get on the soapbox about regularly, that the immigrant rights movement needs to be talking about U.S. foreign policy, otherwise it will fail. We are not going to be able to win the fight on the basis of morality or human rights, because people will ultimately say, yeah, that's all well and good, but I'm losing my job. If we don't talk about U.S. foreign policy and its impact on why people come here, we'll lose. And as the British immigrant rights movement says, and we should adopt, we are here because you were there. A third thing. I know that took 1 second, right? But then, bingo, right? Third thing that we need to be thinking about is something that we talk about in a book, Working People's Assemblies. That is, bringing together working class organizations in cities and counties to develop working people's agendas that are not simply economic, but really do look at the issue of power, and power not at the level of just industry and bargaining units, but how can we, the people at the bottom, actually start to reshape our local environments, and where does race fit in there? Including with that, in that joint economic development. Our communities are very depressed. What are we going to do about that? I don't mean just psychologically, I'm talking about economically. How do we deal with the issue of economic development? Ideologically, we need to frame our battles in terms of expanding democracy. In that sense, there are many allies to be won. We need to be convening gatherings of labor leaders of color. Some unions have tried this. It's got to be more than let's taste each other's food. We've got to talk about what are the issues that we're confronting in our respective movements? I gave a talk some months ago to some laborers, and we were talking about some same issue, and it was very clear in the room that there was a great level of unease in talking about the relationship between Latinos and African Americans. And there were many African Americans who were actually quite progressive that basically felt that the leadership of the laborers had decided that Latinos are now the flavor of the month, and that African Americans are sort of irrelevant. And unless we're talking about this, the tension will increase. And finally, workplace-based and job-based struggles for justice that are linked with a political education program on unity. And that's not just something for African Americans and Latinos, but that we have to be carrying out struggles where people really get why unity is important, and that actually, in fact, we can win. Thank you very much. Well, you see, what's interesting, particularly when, I'm going to stand if that's all right. Particularly when Anglo is asked that question, they ignore the long history of Latinos in U.S. trade unionism. And I'm not talking about in the recent past. I'm talking about the Wobblies, right? And the relationship of Chicanos to the Wobblies. Talking about the independent labor movements of Mexicanos. I'm talking about the role that Chicanos and African Americans played in building the CIO. There would be no CIO, or there would have not been a CIO had it not been for African Americans and Chicanos, right? So these are things that when people ask this question, it really does show this typical U.S. ignorance of history. When the question is posed about how do we get more Latinos into our unions, I have found that that's usually not a problem. That is, it's not that Latinos don't want to join unions. It's a question of whether the union really is interested in having Latinos, right? And whether or not, and I'm talking about more than just having bilingual staff, as important as that is, but whether or not the union is a vehicle for social justice, and not just for wage increases, right? And does the union relate to the concerns of the larger Latino communities? And insofar as the union does, I mean, my experience and what I can see from history is that people will flood into the unions, whether it was in New York with the Puerto Rican community, right, going into unions, or whether it was Chicanos, or whether it's immigrants. You know, the janitors that SEIU organized, or the meatpacking workers that have wanted to join the UFCW. So I think that the issue is more a question of what does the union movement do to reshape itself so it becomes the vehicle. And that becomes a real challenge, because what I find in all too many unions is that there's a desire for quantitative change rather than qualitative change. That is, let us quantitatively change the numbers in our union, but let us not really change the quality of the way that the union operates, the power dynamics, and ultimately who's running the show.
Question here. So a follow-up to that is, if you have a union that has predominantly white leadership, how does that leadership initiate that qualitative change?
I think part of what we have to do is that we have to win over our memberships, our current memberships. And that doesn't happen through resolutions. There's this thing I like to talk about called resolutionary socialism. You know what I mean? I mean, we've all had that, right? So we go, we have that fight at the convention, and we pass that resolution, and we know we're on the road, right? I think that we have to get away from that. We have to conduct internal education with our members and recognize that the change will take place when we win a mandate for change. And there was this thing I was very proud of that we did in AFL-CIO, some of you may be familiar with, called Common Sense Economics. And we started in the mid-90s, and then AFL-CIO and the affiliates lost interest in it, although it's still being used, I've found, around the country by various central labor councils and some unions. But part of the objective of that was to engage in a discussion with the members about capitalism. And I think that when we're talking about issues of immigration and other issues, we have to have a discussion with our members about capitalism, about power, about class, about immigration, about US foreign policy. And our members are not stupid, they're extremely nervous. And as the economy goes further in terms of a meltdown, people are going to be even more nervous, and they're going to be more susceptible to right-wing populism, which is why we have to be very careful about who gets invited to speak in certain things, like Pat Buchanan, like Lou Dobbs, right? Who will say certain things at one time, at one moment will sound very progressive, and then the next moment you're looking for the sheets, right? And so I think that we have to engage in discussion. Many leaders do not want to have a discussion among the members. They don't want to carry out this kind of an education. Part of that is a legacy of the Cold War, where we're not supposed to talk about class, we're not supposed to talk about capitalism. In some unions, you can't even use the word. We have to make up words, free market, stuff like that. And you see what I'm saying? I think that's what we have to really focus on. So we win over a mandate for change by helping to paint a context for why the union has to operate differently. It's the same thing that we need to do if we're going to get unions to organize. Why? Why not just protect what we have? You've got to change that. And ultimately, at least this is what we argue in the book, we have to embrace a different kind of unionism, what we would call social justice unionism, as opposed to the bankrupt unionism that we're following right now.
Other questions? Go ahead, back there, and then.
You've off camera, you made a reference to comparing a South African version of non-racialism to an American version. I'm interested if you could sort of explain what you mean.
Sure. In South Africa, one of the things that I have found very compelling about the movement is that when they talk about non-racial, and given the apartheid history of South Africa and the racial categories, what they mean is anti-racist. Not simply ignoring race, but building an anti-racist society and having an anti-racist practice. In the United States, we use these very gobbledygook terms, multicultural, right, or multiracial. And what we don't do is challenge the whole categorization of race. I don't mean the Ward Connolly, let's pretend that race doesn't exist. I mean the idea of understanding that race is a social political construct, that it came into existence at a certain point for very specific reasons. There's no biological basis of it. And so when the South Africans are talking about non-racial, they're actually talking about deconstructing the racial categorization and building an anti-racist practice in society. That's what we need to be doing here. What we often do in the United States, and it drives me crazy when I hear white people say things like this, they'll say, well, Bill, I don't see race. I just see human beings. And I know we're on camera. I'm going to say it anyway. Bullshit. Right? It's like everybody sees race. Right? It's a question of what you do with it. And even, I would even go further. In not seeing race, you're seeing race. That is, in not seeing race, what that in effect means is that you're not seeing the racial differential in treatment. Because we don't just interact with individuals, we interact with social groups. So we've got to really talk about an anti-racist practice. That's what I meant. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.